I stood in the courthouse lobby watching my brother David shuffle through papers with his attorney, his face pale as winter snow. The fluorescent lights overhead cast harsh shadows under his eyes, making him look older than his 42 years. Behind him, my mother clutched her purse like a lifeline, her perfectly styled silver hair now disheveled from running her fingers through it. My sister Rebecca sat slumped in a plastic chair, her designer heels kicked off, staring at the floor, like it held answers to questions she was too afraid to ask. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. They didn't see me at first. I had positioned myself behind a marble pillar, close enough to observe but far enough to remain invisible. The same way I had been invisible to them 6 months ago when they left me stranded at my own daughter's wedding reception. The same way I had been invisible for years while I funded their dreams, their emergencies, their lives. But today, in this sterile government building that smelled of old coffee and broken promises, I wasn't invisible anymore. Today, I was the reason they were here. The bankruptcy attorney called their names, and I watched David's shoulders sag as he stood up. Rebecca finally looked up from the floor, her mascara slightly smudged, confusion and fear written across her face. My mother straightened her blouse with trembling hands, still trying to maintain the dignity she had built her entire identity around. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have imagined as they walked toward that conference room, was that the woman they had abandoned without a second thought had spent the last 6 months methodically, legally, quietly dismantling every financial safety net they had taken for granted. Every loan I had co-signed, every credit line I had backed, every investment partnership I had naively entered into with family I trusted above all else. I had withdrawn my support not in anger, though anger had fueled the beginning, but in clarity. Cold, crystalline clarity that came only after being left to explain to 60 wedding guests why my own family had vanished between the ceremony and the cake cutting. My name is Marlene Collins, and I used to believe that family meant forever. I used to think that blood was thicker than water, that loyalty was returned with loyalty, and that the people who shared your DNA would never deliberately break your heart. I was 54 years old when I learned how naive those beliefs really were. For most of my adult life, I had been the family bank, the emergency contact, the solution to everyone else's problems. I was the eldest of 3 children, born to parents who had worked blue-collar jobs their entire lives, but dreamed of something more for their kids. My father died when I was 28, leaving behind a modest life insurance policy and a mountain of medical debt. My mother, Patricia, had never worked outside the home, and suddenly found herself trying to navigate a world she had never prepared for. I stepped in without hesitation. I was working as a commercial real estate agent at the time, having built a successful career from nothing but determination and an ability to see potential where others saw problems. I helped my mother refinance the house, took over managing her finances, and made sure she could maintain the lifestyle she was accustomed to. It felt natural, responsible, loving. I was the eldest daughter, and this was what eldest daughters did. David, my younger brother, had always been the dreamer in the family. He was 5 years younger than me, charming in that easy way that made people want to help him succeed. He had tried his hand at various businesses over the years, each one funded partially by family loans that were never quite repaid. There was the food truck venture that lasted 8 months, the landscaping company that folded after 2 years, and the auto repair shop that never quite turned a profit. Each time, I found myself writing checks to help him get back on his feet, believing that this time would be different, that he just needed the right opportunity to flourish. Rebecca, the baby of the family at 38, had married young and divorced twice. She was beautiful in that effortless way that made everything look easy, even when her life was falling apart. She had 2 children from her first marriage, both now in college, and she worked sporadically as a freelance graphic designer. Rebecca had a talent for finding herself in financial crises that required immediate attention, usually right around the time my quarterly commission checks came. In a broken transmission, an unexpected tax bill, medical expenses not covered by insurance. There was always something, and there was always me to fix it. I had never married young like Rebecca, and I had never been a dreamer like David. I had been practical, focused, determined to build something stable. I met my husband James when I was 31. He was a high school history teacher, steady and kind, with a dry sense of humor that made me laugh during the long hours I spent showing properties to difficult clients. We married after 2 years of dating, and our daughter Sarah was born when I was 34. James understood my commitment to my family, even when it sometimes strained our own finances. He never complained when I wrote another check to David, or when Rebecca showed up at our house in tears over her latest crisis. He would just squeeze my shoulder and remind me that family was important, that we were fortunate to be in a position to help. He was right, of course. We were fortunate. I had built a successful real estate business, James had his teacher's pension and summers off to pursue his passion for woodworking, and we lived comfortably in a 4-bedroom colonial in an established neighborhood with good schools. Sarah grew up knowing her aunts and uncle as people who were always around, always welcome, always part of our family gatherings. She called my mother Grandma Patty and spent countless weekends at her house, learning to bake cookies and playing dress up in my mother's old jewelry. David taught Sarah how to throw a curveball and took her to baseball games when James was busy with school. Rebecca painted Sarah's nails and took her shopping for school clothes, treating her like the little sister she never had. For years, this felt like what family was supposed to be: interconnected, supportive, there for each other through thick and thin. I was proud of the role I played in keeping everyone stable, everyone connected. When Sarah graduated high school, with honors and received a full scholarship to study engineering at the state university, my entire family was there cheering in the bleachers. When David finally opened a successful automotive diagnostic shop, we all celebrated at dinner, toasting his persistence and hard work. When Rebecca met Tom, a divorced father of 2 who seemed to genuinely care about her and her kids, we welcomed him into our fold with open arms. I thought we were solid. I thought we were the kind of family that nothing could shake. The first crack appeared during Sarah's junior year of college. She had been dating a young man named Michael for about a year, and their relationship had grown serious enough that she wanted to bring him home for Christmas. Michael came from a wealthy family in Connecticut. His father was a surgeon, his mother was a federal judge, and he was studying to become a lawyer himself. When Sarah first told me about him, I could hear the nervousness in her voice, the worry that we wouldn't be impressive enough, sophisticated enough, wealthy enough. I assured her that anyone who truly cared about her wouldn't judge her family, and I meant it. But when Michael arrived for Christmas dinner, I began to see our family dynamic through different eyes. David showed up an hour late, having stopped at a bar on the way over to calm his nerves about meeting Sarah's boyfriend. Rebecca arrived in a dress that was too tight and too low cut for a family dinner, immediately monopolizing the conversation with stories about her dramatic breakup and reconciliation with Tom. My mother spent the entire evening asking Michael intrusive questions about his family's money and making comments about how nice it must be to never worry about bills. I watched Sarah's face throughout the evening, saw how she cringed when David made crude jokes, how she apologized with her eyes when Rebecca interrupted Michael's attempts to talk about his studies, how she seemed to shrink into herself as my mother grilled him about his father's medical practice. James tried to steer conversations toward safer topics, but the damage was done. Michael was polite, gracious even, but I could see him filing away details, forming judgments, wondering what kind of family he was potentially marrying into. After they left, Sarah called me in tears. Michael had made comments during the drive back to campus about how different our family was from what he was used to, how dramatic and chaotic dinner had been. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. He hadn't been cruel, according to Sarah, just honest. But his honesty had stung her in ways she was still processing. That conversation planted a seed of awareness that I tried to ignore, but couldn't quite shake. For the first time, I began to notice patterns I had been blind to for years. How David always seemed to need money right around the time I received large commission checks. How Rebecca's crises always required immediate financial intervention, but never seemed to result in lasting changes to her spending habits or lifestyle choices. How my mother had grown comfortable expecting me to handle any expense that exceeded her monthly Social Security check, from car repairs to medical bills to home maintenance. I began to realize that what I had seen as family loyalty, they had come to see as family obligation. Not their obligation to me, but my obligation to them. I was the responsible one, the successful one, the one who could afford to help. Therefore, helping had become not a choice I made out of love, but a service I provided because it was expected. The realization should have been jarring, but it crept in slowly, like cold water rising around my ankles. I started paying closer attention to conversations, started noticing how quickly discussions turned to money, how often my family members brought up their problems in my presence, how rarely anyone asked about my own struggles or challenges. When Sarah's senior year arrived, she and Michael had remained together despite my family's rocky first impression. They were talking about marriage, about moving to Connecticut after graduation, so Michael could attend law school there. Sarah was excited about the opportunity, but I could sense her anxiety about distance, about leaving the family dynamic she had always known, even if that dynamic was beginning to show its cracks. I wanted her engagement and wedding to be perfect, not because I needed to prove anything to Michael's family, but because Sarah deserved to have her special day be about her and her happiness. I started planning early, setting aside money each month, researching venues and vendors, dreaming of the kind of celebration that would properly honor the remarkable young woman my daughter had become. Sarah had always been independent, academically gifted, and refreshingly free of the drama that seemed to follow the rest of my family. She worked part-time throughout college, earned excellent grades, and managed her own finances responsibly. She was everything I had hoped she would become, proof that the stability James and I had worked to provide had given her the foundation she needed to build her own successful life. When Sarah and Michael announced their engagement during spring break of her senior year, I was overjoyed. Michael had proposed during a weekend trip to Boston, presenting her with a simple but elegant solitaire ring that suited her perfectly. They planned to marry the following October, after Sarah graduated and had time to prepare for the kind of wedding she had always dreamed of. I threw myself into wedding planning with the same energy I brought to everything else in my life. Sarah wanted something traditional but not overly formal, elegant but not pretentious. We found a perfect venue at a historic inn about an hour outside the city, with gardens for the ceremony and a ballroom for the reception. Sarah chose a classic A-line dress with delicate lace sleeves, and we selected flowers that would complement the autumn foliage. Everything was coming together beautifully. But as the wedding date approached, the familiar pattern of family financial crises began to accelerate. David's automotive shop, which had been doing well for several years, suddenly faced a major lawsuit from a customer who claimed faulty diagnostic work had damaged his engine. The legal fees were mounting, and David needed $20,000 to retain a proper attorney. Rebecca's ex-husband had stopped paying child support, leaving her unable to make her mortgage payments just as her youngest was starting his sophomore year of college. My mother's central air conditioning system failed during the hottest August on record, and the replacement cost was well beyond her monthly budget. Each crisis was real, urgent, and heartbreaking. Each one required immediate attention and financial intervention, and each one chipped away at the money I had carefully saved for Sarah's wedding. I didn't tell Sarah about the family financial emergencies. This was her time, her celebration, and I was determined not to let anyone else's problems overshadow her happiness. I quietly moved money from my retirement accounts, took a larger mortgage on the house, and put some expenses on credit cards. I convinced myself it was temporary, that I would recover the funds after the wedding when the real estate market picked up in the spring. But the requests didn't stop. David needed additional legal fees when his case went to mediation. Rebecca's car was repossessed, and she needed help buying a reliable used vehicle to get to work. My mother fell and broke her wrist, resulting in medical bills that exceeded her insurance coverage. By September, just weeks before Sarah's wedding, I had depleted most of my liquid savings and was running credit card balances for the first time in my adult life. James knew some of what was happening, but not the full extent. He trusted me to manage our finances, and I had always been conservative and responsible with money. I downplayed the family loans, describing them as temporary help rather than the systematic drain they had become. I didn't want him to worry, and I didn't want him to suggest that I stop helping my family when they were facing such serious problems. The week before the wedding, Rebecca called in tears. Tom had broken up with her again, this time permanently, and she was having what she described as a complete emotional breakdown. She couldn't imagine attending Sarah's wedding alone, couldn't face the questions from relatives about where Tom was, couldn't bear to pretend everything was fine when her world was falling apart. I listened patiently, offered comfort and reassurance, and promised that everything would be okay. Rebecca was always dramatic during relationship turbulence, and I assumed this was another temporary crisis that would resolve itself once the immediate emotions settled. I suggested she invite a friend as her +1, or simply attend solo and enjoy dancing with David and the other family members who would be there. But Rebecca had other ideas. She had met someone new, she explained, a man named Rick who was helping her through this difficult time. He was older, divorced, financially stable, and he understood what she was going through because he had been through his own messy divorce. She had only known him for 2 weeks, but she felt a connection that she had never experienced before. She wanted to bring Rick to the wedding as her date. I hesitated. Sarah had already given the final head count to the caterer, and adding another guest at the last minute would cost extra money I didn't have. More importantly, bringing a man she had known for 2 weeks to Sarah's wedding seemed inappropriate and potentially disruptive. This was supposed to be about Sarah and Michael, not about Rebecca's latest romantic drama. When I gently suggested that Sarah's wedding might not be the best place to introduce a new relationship, Rebecca became defensive and then angry. She accused me of being controlling, of never supporting her when she needed it most, of caring more about appearances than about her happiness. The conversation escalated quickly, with Rebecca ultimately declaring that if Rick wasn't welcome, then she wouldn't be attending the wedding either. I was stunned. This was Sarah's wedding, Rebecca's own niece, the girl she had helped raise, and claimed to love like a daughter. The idea that she would miss this milestone over a man she barely knew seemed impossible to comprehend. But Rebecca was serious. When I tried to call her back the next day to discuss a compromise, she didn't answer. When I drove to her house, she wasn't home. When I reached out through mutual friends, the message came back that Rebecca needed space to think about family priorities and couldn't commit to attending the wedding under such controlling circumstances. I was heartbroken, but I didn't tell Sarah what was happening. I simply said that Rebecca was dealing with some personal issues and might not be able to make it to the wedding. Sarah was disappointed but not entirely surprised, given Rebecca's history of drama during important family events. David's situation was different, but equally devastating. 2 days before the wedding, his attorney informed him that the lawsuit settlement negotiations had failed, and the case was going to trial. The trial date was set for the Monday after Sarah's wedding, and David needed to be in court with his legal team to prepare for testimony. He had no choice but to miss the wedding. I understood that legal obligations were serious, but the timing felt cruel and suspicious. David had known about this lawsuit for months, had been working with attorneys for weeks, and somehow the critical preparation meetings were scheduled for the exact weekend of his niece's wedding. When I questioned the timing, David became defensive, insisting that he had no control over the court schedule and that missing Sarah's wedding was breaking his heart. But David's absence meant more than just an empty chair at the reception. He was supposed to walk my mother down the aisle during the processional, since my father was no longer alive to escort her. He was supposed to give a toast during the reception, sharing memories of Sarah's childhood and welcoming Michael into the family. He was supposed to be there, present and supportive, during one of the most important days of our family's life. My mother's response to David's absence was perhaps the most hurtful of all. Instead of expressing disappointment or sadness about missing her granddaughter's wedding, she immediately began planning to leave the reception early so she could drive to David's house and help him prepare for his court appearance. She would attend the ceremony, she said, but she needed to leave before dinner to be there for David when he needed her most. The message was clear. David's legal troubles were more important than Sarah's wedding celebration. Rebecca's new relationship drama took precedence over family obligations. My mother's role as David's supporter outweighed her role as Sarah's grandmother. I had spent months planning every detail of this wedding, had drained my savings to pay for it, had stressed over seating charts and menu selections and flower arrangements. I had envisioned my entire family gathered together, celebrating Sarah's happiness, toasting her future, creating memories that would last a lifetime. Instead, I was facing the prospect of explaining to Sarah and Michael's families why half of the bride's immediate family would be absent or leaving early. I was imagining empty chairs at the family table, missing faces in the family photos, a reception that would be marked more by who wasn't there than by who was. The night before the wedding, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea and a notebook, trying to figure out how to rearrange the seating chart to account for the absences. James found me there at midnight, staring at the paper with tears in my eyes. He sat down beside me and put his arm around my shoulders. He didn't say anything at first, just held me while I cried for the family celebration I had planned and the reality I was facing. Finally, he spoke. "They're making choices, Marlene, and those choices are showing you who they really are." I wanted to defend them. I wanted to explain David's legal situation and Rebecca's emotional crisis and my mother's divided loyalties. But in that moment, sitting in my kitchen at midnight before my daughter's wedding, I couldn't find the words to justify their choices. James was right. They were making choices, and their choices were making it clear that Sarah's wedding, my months of planning and financial sacrifice, our family's opportunity to celebrate together, simply wasn't a priority for them. That realization should have prepared me for what was coming. But even then, even knowing they had chosen to prioritize other things over Sarah's wedding, I never imagined they would abandon me completely on the day itself. The morning of Sarah's wedding dawned crisp and clear, with October sunlight filtering through amber leaves and painting everything in golden hues. I woke up early, my stomach tight with nervous excitement, and found James already in the kitchen making coffee. He handed me a mug and kissed my forehead, his eyes crinkling with the kind of smile that had gotten me through 23 years of marriage. "Today's going to be perfect," he said, and I wanted desperately to believe him. Sarah was staying at the historic inn the night before the wedding, a tradition she had insisted on to make the morning feel special and ceremonial. I would join her there for breakfast and the getting ready process, while James handled the last-minute details, with the vendors and the setup crew. We had choreographed this day down to the minute, determined that everything would go smoothly despite the family complications that had emerged over the past week. My mother had called the night before to confirm she would be attending the ceremony, though she reiterated her plan to leave during the cocktail hour to help David prepare for his Monday court date. Rebecca hadn't returned any of my calls since our argument about bringing Rick to the wedding, but I held on to hope that she would show up at the last minute. David had sent a text expressing his regrets and promising to make it up to Sarah after. His legal issues were resolved. I tried to focus on the positives as I drove to the inn. Sarah was marrying a wonderful man who clearly adored her. The weather was perfect for an outdoor ceremony. The flowers had arrived fresh and beautiful. And the photographer had already sent preview shots of the venue that took my breath away. Michael's family had driven up from Connecticut the day before and seemed genuinely excited about the celebration. Sarah was happy, radiant, ready to start her new life. When I arrived at the bridal suite, Sarah was sitting by the window in her silk robe, sipping orange juice and reading cards from her college friends who couldn't attend. Her hair was already styled in an elegant updo, with small white flowers woven through the curls, and her makeup artist was setting up her station in the bathroom. Sarah looked up when I entered, her face glowing with the kind of joy that made all the stress and expense feel worthwhile. "Mom," she said, standing to hug me, "I can't believe today is finally here." I held her tight, breathing in the scent of her perfume and trying to memorize the moment. This was my baby girl, the little girl who used to play dress-up in my closet, who brought me dandelions picked from the backyard, who called me every week from college just to hear my voice. Today, she was becoming a wife, starting her own family, taking the next step into independence and adulthood. The morning passed in a blur of activity. The makeup artist worked her magic while Sarah and I talked about everything and nothing. The comfortable conversation of a mother and daughter who had always been close. The photographer captured candid moments of preparation. And the wedding coordinator stopped by to confirm that everything was on schedule. Sarah's maid of honor, her college roommate Emma, arrived with mimosas and stories about their wild adventures that made Sarah laugh until tears of joy threatened her makeup. But as the ceremony time approached, the absence of my family became harder to ignore. Sarah kept glancing at her phone, waiting for a text from Rebecca or a last-minute call from David. She asked about my mother's arrival time, and I had to explain that Grandma Patty would be coming directly to the ceremony site rather than joining us for the pre-wedding preparations. "Is everything okay with the family?" Sarah asked as Emma stepped out to take a phone call. "Everyone seems stressed lately." I smoothed an imaginary wrinkle from her dress, buying time to find the right words. "Everyone's dealing with their own challenges right now, sweetheart. But today is about you and Michael, and the people who are here because they love you." Sarah nodded, but I could see the disappointment in her eyes. She had grown up surrounded by extended family, had always counted on her aunt and uncle to be present for major milestones. The realization that they might not prioritize her wedding the way she had hoped was settling in, and it was breaking my heart to watch. The ceremony itself was everything Sarah had dreamed it would be. The gardens at the historic inn provided a perfect backdrop, with towering oak trees and carefully maintained flower beds creating a natural cathedral. Michael waited at the altar in his navy suit, his face lighting up when he saw Sarah walking down the aisle on James's arm. My mother arrived just as the processional began, sliding into the front row with a tight smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I watched through tears as Sarah and Michael exchanged vows they had written themselves, promising to support each other's dreams, to build a life based on mutual respect and shared values, to face whatever challenges came their way as a team. Their love was evident in every word, every glance, every touch. This was what marriage was supposed to look like, I thought. This was what commitment and partnership really meant. The photographer captured every moment, from Sarah's radiant smile to Michael's emotional reaction when she promised to love him forever. James squeezed my hand during the ring exchange, and I felt overwhelmed with gratitude for the life we had built together, the daughter we had raised, the family we had created through love and intention rather than obligation and expectation. After the ceremony, guests moved to the cocktail area for drinks and appetizers while the wedding party took photos. This was when my mother was supposed to leave, and I watched with growing dread as she approached me during a quiet moment between photo sessions. "Marlene, dear," she said, adjusting her purse strap, "I need to head out now to help David. You understand, don't you? He's so stressed about Monday, and I promised I'd make him dinner and help him organize his documents. I stared at her, unable to believe what I was hearing. Mom, the reception is just starting. Sarah specifically asked you to stay for dinner and the father-daughter dance. She wants you to meet Michael's grandparents, and we haven't even cut the cake yet. My mother's expression grew defensive. Sarah will understand. David needs me. Right now, and this lawsuit could ruin him financially. Family takes care of family, Marlene. You know that better than anyone. The irony of her words hit me like a physical blow. Family takes care of family. I had been taking care of this family financially for over 20 years, had emptied my savings to pay for this wedding, while simultaneously funding David's legal defense and Rebecca's latest crisis. But when Sarah needed her family to simply show up and celebrate with her, suddenly other priorities took precedence. Please don't leave, I said quietly. Sarah has been looking forward to this day her entire life. She wants her grandmother here for the whole celebration. My mother's face softened slightly, but her resolve didn't waver. I'll call her tomorrow and explain. She's a smart girl. She'll understand that sometimes adults have to make difficult choices. I watched her gather her things and approach Sarah, who was posing with Michael and his family near the gazebo. I saw Sarah's face fall when my mother explained she had to leave early, saw her nod politely while her eyes filled with confusion and hurt. My mother hugged Sarah briefly, made small talk with Michael's parents about what a lovely ceremony it had been, and then disappeared toward the parking lot without looking back. The cocktail hour continued around me, but I felt like I was watching it from underwater. Michael's family mingled gracefully with our remaining guests. James charmed everyone with stories about Sarah's childhood, and Sarah herself handled her grandmother's early departure with the grace she had always shown in difficult situations. But I could see the disappointment in her posture, the way she kept scanning the crowd as if expecting Rebecca or David to appear at any moment. When the wedding coordinator announced that dinner was ready, I realized with growing panic that the family table was going to look devastatingly empty. I had planned for 8 people: Sarah and Michael, James and me, my mother, David, Rebecca, and Rebecca's +1. Now there would be 4 of us, surrounded by empty chairs that would serve as a visible reminder of who had chosen not to be there. I quickly asked the coordinator to remove the extra place settings and shift some of Michael's cousins to our table to fill the empty spaces. It was a practical solution, but it felt like erasing my family from Sarah's wedding, acknowledging that they simply didn't matter enough to show up. During dinner, Michael's father gave a beautiful toast about love, commitment, and the importance of family support in a marriage. He spoke about how impressed he and his wife were with Sarah's character and accomplishments, and how welcome Sarah was in their family. James followed with his own toast, talking about watching Sarah grow from a curious little girl into a confident young woman, and expressing his confidence that she and Michael would build a wonderful life together. Then came the moment I had been dreading. The coordinator approached our table and quietly asked if anyone from the bride's extended family would be giving a toast. Traditionally, this would have been David's role, as Sarah's uncle and the only brother I had. He had given speeches at family gatherings for years, always managing to find the perfect balance of humor and sentimentality that left everyone laughing and crying at the same time. I felt all eyes at the table turning toward me, waiting for an explanation or an alternative. Sarah looked at me with a mixture of hope and resignation, as if she had already accepted that this was another tradition that wouldn't happen at her wedding. Without thinking, I stood up and asked for the microphone. I had never been comfortable with public speaking, had always been happy to let David handle the family toasts and speeches. But standing there in that ballroom, looking at my daughter's expectant face and the curious expressions of 60 wedding guests, I felt a surge of protective fury that gave me courage. "Good evening, everyone," I began, my voice steadier than I had expected. "I'm Marlene Collins, Sarah's mother, and I want to thank you all for being here to celebrate this incredible couple." I paused, gathering my thoughts and my emotions. Sarah has always been the kind of person who brings out the best in everyone around her. She's generous, hardworking, loyal, and kind. She's the daughter every parent dreams of raising, and the wife every mother-in-law hopes to welcome into the family. I looked directly at Sarah, my voice growing stronger. But most importantly, Sarah understands what real family means. She understands that family isn't just about blood relations or shared DNA. Real family is about the people who show up for you, who celebrate your victories and support you through challenges, who choose to be present for the moments that matter most. The ballroom had grown quiet, everyone listening intently. I could see James nodding encouragingly, and Michael's parents smiling warmly. Sarah, I continued, you are surrounded tonight by people who chose to be here, who prioritized your happiness, who wanted to witness the beginning of your marriage to Michael. This is your real family. These are the people who will be there for you throughout your life, not because they have to be, but because they want to be. I raised my glass. Fighting. Back tears. So let's toast to Sarah and Michael, and to chosen family, and to the truth that love is always a choice. May you always choose each other, and may you always be surrounded by people who choose you in return. The applause was warm and sustained, and I saw several guests wiping their eyes. Sarah was crying openly, but smiling through her tears. Michael stood up and hugged me tightly, whispering, "Thank you," in my ear. Even some of Michael's relatives, who barely knew me, seemed moved by the speech. But as I sat back down, I realized what I had just done. I had essentially announced to a room full of people that my own family had chosen not to prioritize Sarah's wedding. I had publicly acknowledged their absence and, by implication, their lack of commitment to what should have been an important family celebration. The rest of the reception passed in a haze of forced cheerfulness. Sarah and Michael's first dance was beautiful, and their joy was infectious enough to lift the spirits of everyone around them. James danced with Sarah during the father-daughter dance, and I danced with Michael during the mother-son dance, both of us laughing as he tried to lead me through steps I had never learned. But throughout the evening, I was acutely aware of the empty spaces where my family should have been. I imagined Rebecca laughing at the best man's jokes, David telling embarrassing stories about Sarah's childhood, my mother dancing with Michael's grandfather and charming him with stories about her granddaughter's accomplishments. Instead, I found myself explaining their absences over and over again to curious guests. David was dealing with a legal matter. Rebecca was going through a difficult time. My mother had another family obligation. Each explanation felt like a small betrayal, both of my family for putting me in this position and of the guests who deserved honesty about why the bride's immediate family was virtually non-existent. The worst moment came during the cake cutting, when Sarah looked around for her Uncle David to take the traditional photo of the bride and groom feeding each other cake. David had always been the family photographer at celebrations, armed with an expensive camera and an eye for capturing candid moments. Sarah had specifically requested that he document this part of the reception, wanting his artistic touch for photos that would go in the family album. When she realized David wasn't there, Sarah's composure finally cracked. I saw her whisper something to Michael, saw him pull her close and say something reassuring. The professional photographer stepped in to capture the moment, but I could see the disappointment in Sarah's eyes as she posed for pictures that would forever remind her of who wasn't there to take them. As the evening wound down and guests began to leave, Sarah and Michael made their rounds to thank everyone for coming. When they reached our table, Sarah hugged James and me tightly, expressing gratitude for the beautiful wedding and the love we had shown them throughout the planning process. "Mom," she said softly, "I'm sorry your family couldn't be here tonight. I know how much you wanted everyone together for this." The fact that she was comforting me, that she was apologizing for other people's choices on her wedding day, broke something inside me. This remarkable young woman, who should have been focused entirely on her own happiness, was worried about my feelings and my disappointment. "Don't you apologize for anything," I said firmly. "This wedding was perfect because you were perfect, and everyone who needed to be here was here." But as I watched Sarah and Michael drive away in their decorated car, heading to a nearby hotel for their wedding night before leaving for their honeymoon in Italy, I felt a profound sense of loss that had nothing to do with my daughter's transition to married life. I had spent 6 months planning this celebration, had depleted my savings to pay for it, had stressed over every detail to ensure that Sarah would have the wedding of her dreams. I had envisioned this day as a culmination of years of family love and support, a celebration that would strengthen the bonds between all of us and create memories we would treasure forever. Instead, I felt like I had been abandoned, not just by my family's physical absence, but by their emotional absence, their inability to prioritize Sarah's happiness over their own convenience and drama. The people I had supported financially and emotionally for decades had failed to show up when it mattered most, leaving me to carry the weight of their choices and explain their absences to a room full of people who expected better from family. James and I drove home in relative silence, both of us emotionally exhausted from the long day. As we pulled into our driveway, I saw a light on in the kitchen and felt a flutter of hope. Maybe Rebecca had come to the house to apologize, to explain why she had missed the wedding but wanted to make amends. Maybe David had finished his legal preparations early and stopped by to hear about the ceremony he had missed. But the house was empty, except for our golden retriever, Murphy, who greeted us with his usual enthusiasm. The light I had seen was just the automatic timer we used when we were away from home, designed to make the house look occupied and welcoming. I sat on the edge of our bed, still wearing my mother-of-the-bride dress, a dusty blue silk sheath that Sarah had helped me choose months earlier. James sat beside me, loosening his tie and kicking off his dress shoes. "It was a beautiful wedding," he said finally. Sarah looked radiant, Michael seemed happy, and everyone had a wonderful time. I nodded, unable to trust my voice. "But I'm angry," James continued, his voice quiet but intense. "I'm angry at your mother for leaving early. I'm angry at David for missing his niece's wedding for something that could have been rescheduled. And I'm furious at Rebecca for choosing some guy she barely knows over Sarah." The permission to feel angry, coming from James, who rarely criticized anyone, opened the floodgates. I started crying then, not the gentle tears of wedding emotion, but the deep, wrenching sobs of betrayal and disappointment. "I've given them everything," I said, through my tears. "I've bailed them out financially dozens of times. I've listened to their problems, supported their dreams, covered for their mistakes. And when I needed them to simply show up for one day, for Sarah's wedding day, they couldn't be bothered." James held me while I cried, not trying to offer solutions or explanations, just letting me feel the full weight of what had happened. "They took your money," he said eventually, "and then they took your daughter's day. And they're going to act like neither of those things matters." He was right, of course. I knew with certainty that my family would expect life to return to normal after this. They would call when they needed money again, would expect me to be available for their next crisis, would assume that my loyalty and support were unconditional regardless of how they treated me or my immediate family. But something had shifted during Sarah's wedding day. Watching my daughter handle their abandonment with grace while I made excuses for their choices had crystallized something I had been trying to ignore for months. My family's financial emergencies weren't emergencies at all. They were patterns. Their inability to prioritize Sarah's wedding wasn't about conflicting obligations. It was about taking my support for granted while offering nothing meaningful in return. I had been funding their lives while they failed to show up for mine. That night, I lay awake long after James had fallen asleep, staring at the ceiling and thinking about the wedding that could have been, versus the reality of what had actually happened. I thought about Sarah's disappointed face when my mother left early, about the empty chairs at the family table, about having to give a speech that essentially acknowledged my family's absence and lack of commitment. I thought about the tens of thousands of dollars I had spent on this wedding. Money that had come from my retirement accounts and credit cards because my savings had been depleted by family loans that were never repaid. I thought about David's legal fees, Rebecca's mortgage payments, my mother's home repairs, and all the other financial assistance I had provided over the years. Most of all, I thought about the pattern that had become clear during the wedding planning process. My family took my support for granted while offering excuses for why they couldn't reciprocate when I needed them. They expected me to be available for their emergencies while treating my important moments as optional. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. James was already downstairs making coffee, and I could hear him talking to Murphy in the gentle tone he used with both our dog and his most challenging students. I joined him in the kitchen, still wearing my robe but feeling more awake and alert than I had in months. "I'm done," I said without preamble. James looked up from the newspaper he was reading. "Done with what?" "Done being the family bank. Done making excuses for people who don't show up. Done funding other people's lives while they can't be bothered to celebrate mine." James studied my face carefully, as if trying to determine whether this was grief, talking, or genuine resolve. "What does that mean, practically speaking?" he asked. I sat down across from him, accepting the cup of coffee he handed me. "It means no more loans, no more bailouts, no more emergency funds for people who can't manage to attend their niece's wedding." James nodded slowly. "What about the money they already owe you?" I had been thinking about that question all night. David owed me approximately $35,000 in accumulated loans for his various business ventures and legal fees. Rebecca owed nearly $20,000 for her mortgage payments, car repairs, and children's college expenses. My mother owed about $8,000 for home maintenance and medical bills that had exceeded her insurance coverage. None of these loans had ever been formalized with paperwork or payment schedules. They had been family transactions based on trust and love and the assumption that we were all working together to support each other through difficult times. "I'm going to find out what legal recourse I have," I said, "and I'm going to start by pulling my name off anything I've co-signed for them." James reached across the table and took my hand. "Are you sure about this? Once you start down this road, there's no going back to the way things were." I thought about Sarah's face when my mother left her wedding early, about the empty chairs at our family table, about 20 years of being taken for granted by people who claimed to love me. "The way things were wasn't working," I said. "At least not for me." That afternoon, while James worked in his woodshop and I had the house to myself, I began making a list. Not a grocery list or a to-do list, but an accounting of exactly how much money I had given to my family members over the past 5 years, and what financial obligations I was still responsible for on their behalf. The numbers were staggering. Even limiting myself to just the past 5 years, I had provided over $80,000 in direct loans, plus co-signed for David's business equipment lease, Rebecca's car loan, and my mother's medical payment plan. I was financially liable for their debts while having no legal recourse to collect the money they owed me. I had funded their lives while they failed to fund their commitment to mine. The realization should have made me angrier, but instead, it made me focused. I wasn't interested in revenge or dramatic confrontations. I was interested in protecting myself and my immediate family from further financial and emotional damage. I spent the rest of the afternoon researching legal options for debt collection and cosigner release procedures. I learned that I could formally demand repayment of personal loans and that I could petition to be removed from co-signed obligations under certain circumstances. I also learned that bankruptcy proceedings could affect co-signers in ways I had never considered. That evening, I called Sarah and Michael at their hotel to see how they were enjoying their first day as a married couple. Sarah sounded happy and relaxed, already referring to Michael as my husband with obvious delight. They were excited about their flight to Italy the next morning, and grateful for the wedding contributions that had made their honeymoon possible. I didn't mention my family's behavior or my growing anger about their absence. This was Sarah's time to be happy, to start her marriage without the burden of extended family drama. But I did ask her one question that had been weighing on my mind. "Sarah," I said, "how do you feel about the wedding? Was it what you wanted it to be?" There was a pause, and I could hear Michael saying something in the background. "Mom," Sarah said finally, "the wedding was beautiful. You and Dad did an amazing job, and Michael's family was wonderful. I just wish—" She trailed off. "What do you wish, sweetheart?" "I wish your family had acted like family. I wish they had shown up for you the way you've always shown up for them." The fact that Sarah had noticed the imbalance, that she understood the sacrifice I had made, and the support I hadn't received, both validated my feelings and broke my heart all over again. "I love you, Mom," Sarah continued, "and I want you to know that having you and Dad there, having you so invested in making the day special, meant everything to me. You're the best family anyone could ask for." After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen, with the list of family debts and legal research spread across the table. James found me there an hour later, surrounded by paperwork and wearing the expression he recognized as my problem-solving face. "What's the plan?" he asked, sitting down beside me. I looked at my husband, this steady, supportive man who had watched me deplete our savings to fund other people's emergencies while they failed to show up for our daughter's wedding. "The plan," I said, "is to stop being a victim of my own generosity." The Monday morning after Sarah's wedding, I drove to the office of Patricia Vance, the attorney I had researched over the weekend. Her practice specialized in family financial disputes and debt recovery, and her website promised aggressive representation for clients seeking to recover what's rightfully theirs. I had made the appointment before I could change my mind, before guilt or family loyalty could weaken my resolve. Patricia's office was located in a professional building downtown, with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city's financial district. She was a woman in her early 50s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a neat bun, and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she had seen every type of family financial drama imaginable. "Tell me about your situation," she said after I had settled into the chair across from her polished desk. I had prepared for this conversation, had organized my thoughts and documentation over the weekend, but sitting there in that sterile office, I suddenly felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what I was considering. These weren't strangers who had defaulted on business loans. This was my family, the people I had loved and supported for decades. But then I thought about Sarah's face when my mother left her wedding early, about the empty chairs at our family table, about 20 years of financial sacrifice that had been met with abandonment when I needed them most. I opened my folder and began to speak. I told Patricia about the accumulated loans to David, the mortgage payments for Rebecca, the medical bills for my mother. I explained how none of these transactions had been documented with formal loan agreements, how they had all been presented as temporary emergencies that somehow never resolved into repayment. I showed her the bank statements that documented the withdrawals, the credit card bills that showed the cash advances, the retirement account statements that revealed how much of my own financial security I had sacrificed. Patricia listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. When I finished my recitation of facts and figures, she leaned back in her chair and studied me with the expression I couldn't quite read. "How much total are we talking about?" she asked. I had calculated the number multiple times over the weekend, each time hoping I had made an error that would reduce the devastating total. "Approximately $63,000 in direct loans over the past 5 years, plus I'm co-signed on obligations totaling about $40,000 more." Patricia nodded as if these numbers were not unusual in her experience. "And what was the triggering event that brought you to my office today?" I explained about Sarah's wedding, about the family absences and early departures, about realizing That the people I had financially supported for years couldn't be counted on to simply show up for important family celebrations. "So this isn't really about the money," Patricia said. "This is about respect and reciprocity." I considered her words carefully. Was this about the money? I had never expected to get rich from the loans I made to family members, had never charged interest or demanded collateral, but I had expected something in return, even if I hadn't articulated it to myself until now. "It's about both," I said finally. "I can't continue to fund their lives while they treat mine as optional." Patricia opened a fresh file folder and began taking detailed notes about each loan, each co-signed obligation, each financial transaction that connected me to my family's debts. She explained the legal options available for collecting on informal family loans, the procedures for demanding payment, the timeline for legal action if voluntary repayment wasn't forthcoming. "I have to warn you," she said, "pursuing legal action against family members often results in permanent relationship damage. Are you prepared for that possibility?" I thought about David missing Sarah's wedding for a legal consultation that could have been rescheduled. I thought about Rebecca refusing to attend unless she could bring a man she had known for 2 weeks. I thought about my mother leaving during the cocktail hour to help David with paperwork. "I think the relationship damage has already occurred," I said. "I'm just tired of being the only one who pretends it hasn't." Patricia outlined a strategy that would begin with formal demand letters to each family member, requiring repayment within 30 days. If they failed to respond or couldn't pay, we would file collection lawsuits that would become part of the public record. If they still couldn't pay, we could potentially force the sale of assets or garnish wages to satisfy the judgments. The process sounded clinical and cold, nothing like the warm family relationships I had once cherished. But those relationships, I was beginning to understand, had been largely one-sided for years. I had been providing warmth and support while receiving obligation and expectation in return. "There's one more thing you should know," Patricia said as our meeting concluded. "If any of your family members are considering bankruptcy as a way to avoid their debts, your timing could be critical. Debts to family members are still debts, and you have the right to be included in any bankruptcy proceedings as a creditor." I left Patricia's office with a retainer agreement and a timeline for action. The formal demand letters would go out within the week, giving each family member 30 days to respond with either payment plans or explanations for why repayment wasn't possible. After that, if necessary, we would begin the legal proceedings that could result in garnished wages, liens on property, or forced asset sales. I drove home feeling strangely calm, as if I had finally taken action after months of feeling helpless and taken advantage of. James was grading papers at the kitchen table when I arrived, red pen in hand and a stack of essays about the American Revolution spread across the surface. "How did it go?" he asked, looking up from a particularly challenging student's work. "I hired her," I said. "The demand letters go out next week." James nodded approvingly. "Good. It's time they understood that actions have consequences." That afternoon, I began the difficult process of documenting every financial transaction I could remember with my family members. I went through 5 years of bank statements, credit card bills, and check registers, highlighting every loan, every emergency payment, every time I had transferred money to help with a crisis that always seemed to require immediate attention. The pattern that emerged was even more disturbing than I had realized. David's emergencies coincided almost perfectly with my quarterly commission checks from real estate sales. Rebecca's crises always seemed to occur when she knew I had recently closed a large deal. My mother's home maintenance issues invariably surfaced right after I mentioned having extra money or taking on a particularly lucrative client. They had been monitoring my income and timing their requests accordingly. What I had interpreted as coincidental bad luck was actually strategic, financial dependence. The realization made me feel sick. These weren't family members struggling with genuine emergencies who happened to need help when I was able to provide it. These were people who had learned to view my success as their safety net, my financial stability as their backup plan. I had been supporting their lifestyle choices rather than helping them through temporary difficulties. That evening, Rebecca called. It was the first time I had heard from her since our argument about bringing Rick to the wedding, and my stomach clenched when I saw her name on the caller ID. "Marlene," she said when I answered, her voice artificially bright. "I wanted to call and apologize for missing Sarah's wedding. I know you must have been disappointed, and I feel terrible about the whole situation." I waited for her to continue, curious to see how she would explain her absence and what she would request. "The thing is," Rebecca went on, "Rick and I have gotten really serious really quickly, and he proposed to me yesterday. Can you believe it? I'm engaged again." I sat down heavily in the kitchen chair, trying to process what I was hearing. Rebecca was calling to tell me that the man she had known for 3 weeks, the man she had wanted to bring to Sarah's wedding as her date, had proposed marriage. "That's quite fast," I said carefully. "I know it seems sudden, but when you know, right? And Rick is so different from my other relationships. He's stable, financially secure, and he really understands me." I waited for the request that I knew was coming. "The thing is," Rebecca continued, "we want to have a small ceremony next month, just immediate family and close friends. Nothing elaborate, but we'd love to have it at that beautiful garden venue where Sarah got married. I know it's expensive, but Rick's willing to contribute, and I was hoping you might be able to help with some of the costs. You know, as my sister and my maid of honor." The audacity took my breath away. Rebecca had missed my daughter's wedding because I wouldn't allow her to bring a man she barely knew, and now she was asking me to help pay for her wedding to that same man, at the same venue where she had refused to show up just a week earlier. "Rebecca," I said slowly, "I'm not going to be able to help with your wedding expenses." There was a pause, as if she hadn't considered the possibility that I might say no. "What do you mean?" she asked. "Is this about Sarah's wedding?" "Because I already apologized for that, and I thought you understood that I was going through a difficult time." "This isn't about understanding," I said. "This is about priorities and reciprocity. You couldn't prioritize Sarah's wedding enough to attend it, but now you want me to prioritize your wedding enough to fund it. That's completely different," Rebecca said, her voice growing defensive. "Sarah had plenty of family there. My wedding will be smaller, more intimate. I need your support for this." "You needed to support Sarah too," I replied. "But you chose not to. Actions have consequences, Rebecca." The conversation escalated quickly from there, with Rebecca accusing me of being petty and vindictive, of punishing her for one mistake, of failing to understand the complexities of her emotional situation. I listened to her accusations with a growing sense of clarity about the dynamic that had controlled our relationship for years. Rebecca had never learned to accept responsibility for her choices because I had always been there to buffer the consequences. When she made impulsive decisions or failed to follow through on commitments, I provided the financial and emotional support that allowed her to avoid learning from her mistakes. I had enabled her irresponsibility by consistently rescuing her from the results of her own actions. "I have to go," I said when Rebecca paused for breath in her litany of complaints. "I hope your wedding is everything you want it to be." "Marlene, wait," Rebecca said, her tone shifting from anger to desperation. "I'm sorry if I said anything wrong. I know you're upset about Sarah's wedding, and maybe I could have handled things differently. But we're family, and family forgives each other. Can't we talk about this?" "We are talking about this," I said. "And what I'm telling you is that I'm done funding other people's choices while they feel free to ignore mine." I hung up before she could respond, my hands shaking slightly from the adrenaline of confrontation. James appeared in the kitchen doorway, having obviously overheard at least part of the conversation. "Let me guess," he said. "Emergency wedding expenses?" I nodded, still processing what had just happened. She wants me to help pay for her wedding to the man she's known for 3 weeks, the same man she wanted to bring to Sarah's wedding. James shook his head in disbelief. The timing is incredible, even for Rebecca. The next few days passed quietly, with no contact from my family. I continued my financial documentation, worked with Patricia to finalize the demand letters, and tried to focus on my real estate clients who were depending on me to help them buy and sell homes. But underneath the surface calm, I felt like I was waiting for the other shoe to drop. It dropped on Thursday evening when David called. "Marlene," he said without preamble, "I need to talk to you about something important. Can you meet me for coffee tomorrow morning?" David's tone was serious, more formal than his usual casual brother-to-sister communication. Something in his voice made me agree to meet him, despite my growing desire to distance myself from family financial discussions. We met at a small cafe near his automotive shop, the same place where we had celebrated when his business first started showing a profit. David looked tired and older than his 42 years, with stress lines around his eyes and a general air of defeat that I had never seen in him before. "The lawsuit didn't go well," he said after we had ordered coffee and found a quiet table in the back corner. I waited for him to continue, knowing that this conversation was leading somewhere I probably didn't want to go. "The settlement negotiations failed, and now they're demanding over $100,000 in damages. My insurance will cover some of it, but not all. And my attorney says there could be additional lawsuits from other customers who think their cars were damaged by my diagnostic work." David paused, staring into his coffee cup as if it contained answers to questions he was afraid to ask. "The worst part is that the publicity has destroyed my reputation. Word gets around fast in this business, and people don't want to risk having their cars worked on by someone who's being sued for causing engine damage. My customer base has dropped by about 60% in the past month." I could see where this was heading, could feel the familiar weight of an impending request for financial rescue. "I'm going to have to close the shop," David continued. "I can't make the lease payments, can't pay my employees, can't afford the insurance premiums. My attorney thinks I should consider bankruptcy to protect myself from the lawsuit damages and get out from under the business debts." David finally looked up from his coffee, meeting my eyes for the first time since the conversation began. "The thing is, Marlene, I know you co-signed on some of my equipment leases when I was getting started, and I know I owe you money from all the loans you've given me over the years. If I file for bankruptcy, I'm not sure what happens to those obligations." There it was, the real reason for this meeting. David wasn't seeking emotional support or family advice about his business failure. He was warning me that bankruptcy would eliminate his debts to me while potentially leaving me responsible for the equipment leases I had co-signed. "How much am I liable for on the co-signed obligations?" I asked. David shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "About $35,000 for the diagnostic equipment and the computer systems, plus the loans from you, which I think total around $35,000 also. $70,000. If David filed for bankruptcy, I would lose the $35,000 he owed me in personal loans, and I could be held responsible for another $35,000 in equipment leases. The total represented more than a year of my income, money I had worked for and saved and invested in what I thought was my family's mutual success." "When are you planning to file?" I asked. "My attorney wants to do it as soon as possible, before the lawsuit judgments are finalized, probably within the next 2 weeks. I felt a cold clarity settle over me, the same focused calm I experienced when negotiating difficult real estate transactions. David had called this meeting not to seek my help in avoiding bankruptcy, but to prepare me for the financial damage his bankruptcy would cause me. He was managing the situation in the way that would benefit him most, regardless of the cost to me. "David," I said quietly, "you missed Sarah's wedding to prepare for legal meetings that could have been rescheduled." He looked surprised by the change of subject. "I explained that, Marlene. I had no control over the timing." And now you're filing for bankruptcy that will cost me $70,000, and you're giving me 2 weeks' notice as if that's some kind of courtesy. David's expression grew defensive. It's not like I wanted this to happen. The lawsuit forced my hand. I'm losing everything too. No, I said, standing up from the table. You're choosing to lose everything rather than finding another way to handle your debts, and you're choosing to stick me with the bill. I left money on the table for my untouched coffee and walked out of the cafe without looking back. David called my name once, but I didn't turn around. I had heard everything I needed to hear. Driving home, I called Patricia from my car. We need to accelerate the timeline, I told her. David is planning to file for bankruptcy within 2 weeks, and I need to make sure my claims are protected. Patricia's voice was crisp and professional. I'll have the demand letters ready by tomorrow morning. We'll hand-deliver them to each family member and require signed receipts. If they're going to file for bankruptcy, we want your debts to be clearly documented before they do. What about the co-signed obligations? Those are trickier, but we have options. If we can prove that David misrepresented his financial situation when he asked you to co-sign, or if we can show that he incurred additional debts after you co-signed without informing you, we might be able to get you released from those obligations. That evening, I sat down with James and explained what David had told me about the impending bankruptcy. James's reaction was swift and angry, more emotional than I had seen him in years. He's going to bankrupt himself and stick you with his debts, James said, pacing around our kitchen. After you've supported him financially for years, after you've co-signed loans to help his business succeed, he's going to walk away from everything and leave you holding the bag. It gets worse, I said. Rebecca called earlier this week asking me to help pay for her wedding next month to the man she's known for 3 weeks. James stopped pacing and stared at me. The same man she wanted to bring to Sarah's wedding? The same one. She's engaged to him now and wants to get married at the same venue where Sarah got married, the wedding Rebecca refused to attend. James sat down heavily in the chair across from me. These people aren't your family, Marlene. Family doesn't behave this way. They're the only family I have, I said. But even as I spoke the words, I realized they weren't entirely true. Sarah and Michael were my family. James was my family. The people who had celebrated Sarah's wedding, who had shown up and stayed and toasted her happiness, those people were more family to me than the blood relatives who had taken my money and abandoned my daughter. No, James said firmly. Family is the people who show up for you, who consider your needs along with their own, who don't view your success as their entitlement. Your biological relatives are just people who happen to share your DNA. The next morning, Patricia called to confirm that the demand letters were ready for delivery. We had decided to hand-deliver them to ensure they couldn't claim they never received the documents, and to start the 30-day clock for response immediately. I drove to David's automotive shop first, knowing that he would probably be there, early trying to salvage what he could from his failing business. The shop looked different than it had just a few months earlier when business was good. The parking lot was nearly empty. The service bay doors were closed, and there was a general air of abandonment that suggested customers were staying away. David was in his office, surrounded by boxes and paperwork, when I walked in. He looked up hopefully when he heard the door, as if expecting a customer, then his face fell when he saw me. "Marlene," he said, "I'm glad you came by. I wanted to talk more about our conversation yesterday." I handed him the sealed envelope containing the demand letter. "This is a formal request for repayment of the loans I've made to you over the past 5 years, totaling $35,000. You have 30 days to respond with either payment or a proposed payment plan." David opened the envelope and scanned the official letterhead and legal language. His face went pale as he read the detailed accounting of loans and the explicit demand for repayment. "Marlene, you can't be serious about this. We're family." "Family shows up for each other," I said. "Family doesn't miss weddings for convenience and then stick each other with bankruptcy debts." I didn't have a choice about the wedding, David said. And I don't have a choice about the bankruptcy. You know I'd pay you back if I could. You had choices, I replied. You chose not to reschedule your legal meetings. You chose not to attend Sarah's wedding, and you're choosing bankruptcy over finding other ways to handle your debts. I turned to leave, then paused at the door. You have 30 days to respond to the demand letter. After that, this becomes a legal matter. Rebecca was next. She lived in a small townhouse in a development that had been built during the real estate boom, all beige siding and postage stamp yards that looked identical from a distance. Her car wasn't in the driveway, but I could see lights on inside, so I knocked on the front door. Rebecca answered wearing yoga pants and an oversized sweater, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She looked surprised to see me, then pleased, as if my presence might signal that I had reconsidered helping with her wedding expenses. Marlene, she said, opening the door wide. Come in. I'm so glad you're here. I was hoping we could talk about our conversation the other day. I stepped inside, but remained standing in the entryway. The house looked the same as always, comfortably, cluttered with fashion magazines and takeout containers, decorative pillows that had never been fluffed, and the general air of someone who lived paycheck to paycheck despite having a safety net. I brought you something, I said, handing her the demand letter. Rebecca took the envelope with a puzzled expression, as if she couldn't imagine what official document I might be delivering. When she opened it and began reading, her confusion turned to shock, then anger. What is this? She demanded. It's a formal request for repayment of $20,000 in loans I've made to you over the past 5 years, I said. You have 30 days to respond. You can't be serious, Rebecca said, her voice rising. These weren't loans, Marlene. This was family helping family. You never said anything about expecting repayment. I never said anything about not expecting repayment either, I replied. And family helps family, which means family shows up for family weddings. Rebecca's face flushed with anger. This is about Sarah's wedding? You're going to destroy our relationship over one event? This is about respect and reciprocity, I said. It's about 20 years of me giving and you taking, and you not being able to show up for one day when I needed you to. I was going through a crisis, Rebecca protested. Tom had just broken up with me, and I was emotionally devastated. I couldn't handle a big social event. But you could handle getting engaged to someone else 2 weeks later? Rebecca stared at me as if I had slapped her. That's different. Rick helped me heal. He showed me what real love looks like. Real love shows up, I said. Real love doesn't abandon family members at important moments. Real love doesn't ask for money after refusing to provide support. I left Rebecca standing in her doorway, still holding the demand letter and looking stunned. My mother was the last stop, and in some ways the most difficult. She lived in the house where I had grown up, the house my father had bought when I was in elementary school, the house I had helped her keep when he died. My mother was in her garden when I arrived, pulling weeds from the flower beds with the careful attention she had always paid to her yard. She looked up when she heard my car in the driveway, shading her eyes with a dirt-stained garden glove. Marlene, dear, she said, standing up slowly and brushing soil from her knees. What a nice surprise. I was just thinking about Sarah's wedding. Such a beautiful ceremony. I felt a familiar pang of guilt as I approached her. My mother was 78 years old, a widow living on Social Security, and she had always tried her best with the resources available to her. But she had also chosen to leave Sarah's wedding early to help David, and she was part of the family pattern that had taken my support for granted while offering little in return. I need to give you something, I said, handing her the envelope. My mother wiped her hands on her gardening apron before taking the letter. She opened it carefully, reading with the slow concentration of someone who wasn't used to legal documents. I don't understand, she said finally. This says I owe you $8,000 for medical bills and home repairs over the past 5 years, I explained. Money I've paid when your expenses exceeded your monthly income. But those weren't loans, dear, my mother said, looking confused and hurt. That was you helping your mother when she needed it. It was help that I was happy to provide, I said. But help works both ways. When I needed you to stay at Sarah's wedding reception, to be there for your granddaughter's celebration, you chose to leave early to help David instead. My mother's face crumpled slightly. David was facing such serious legal troubles. I thought you would understand that he needed me more than a party did. It wasn't a party, I said quietly. It was your granddaughter's wedding reception. It was the most important day of her life, and she wanted her grandmother there to celebrate with her. I attended the ceremony, my mother protested weakly, and then you left to help the son who's about to file for bankruptcy and stick me with his debts, I said. You have 30 days to respond to this letter. After that, I'll be forced to take legal action to recover the money. I walked back to my car while my mother stood in her garden, still holding the demand letter and looking older and more fragile than I had ever seen her. Part of me wanted to turn around, to take back the letter and pretend this conversation had never happened. But the larger part of me, the part that had been building strength since Sarah's wedding, knew that I had to follow through. They had made their choices. Now they would have to live with the consequences. That afternoon, I received 3 phone calls within an hour of each other. David called first, angry and accusatory, demanding to know how I could treat family like business associates. Rebecca called next, crying and begging me to reconsider, promising that she would find a way to attend future family events if I would just forgive the debt and help with her wedding. My mother called last, confused and hurt, asking if I really intended to take legal action against my own mother over money. I let all 3 calls go to voicemail. I wasn't ready to have the same conversation 3 times, to listen to the same excuses and justifications I had been hearing for years. They had 30 days to respond to the demand letters with payment plans or explanations. Until then, there was nothing more to discuss. That evening, James and I sat on our back porch, with glasses of wine, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. It was the first peaceful moment I had experienced since Sarah's wedding. The first time I had felt like I could breathe without the weight of family obligation pressing down on my chest. "How do you feel?" James asked. I considered the question carefully. How did I feel? Guilty, certainly. Sad about the relationships that might be permanently damaged. Angry about the years of financial exploitation disguised as family loyalty. But underneath all of those emotions, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Free, I said finally. I feel free. The 30-day deadline came and went with deafening silence. Not one of my family members responded to the demand letters, not with payment plans, not with explanations, not even with angry refusals. They simply ignored the legal documents as if pretending they didn't exist would make the debts disappear. Patricia called me on the 31st day to confirm that we had received no responses and to outline our next steps. Her voice carried the professional satisfaction of an attorney who had predicted exactly this outcome. "They're gambling that you'll back down rather than actually take legal action against family members," she explained. "It's a common strategy among people who have been enabled for years. They assume your love will override your legal rights." I was sitting in my home office, surrounded by the financial documents that told the story of 20 years of family exploitation. Bank statements showing tens of thousands in transfers to David's various business ventures. Credit card bills documenting cash advances to cover Rebecca's emergencies. Investment account withdrawals to pay for my mother's medical expenses and home repairs. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now we file lawsuits against all 3 of them," Patricia said matter-of-factly. "Once the judgments are entered, we can begin collection proceedings. Wage garnishment, asset seizure, property liens. We make their financial irresponsibility a legal problem instead of a family problem." The thought of my family members being served with lawsuit papers, of their wages being garnished, of liens being placed on their property, should have filled me with guilt. Instead, I felt a cold determination that surprised me with its intensity. "Do it," I said. Within a week, David, Rebecca, and my mother had all been served with lawsuit papers. The legal documents were delivered by a professional process server who ensured that each defendant signed for receipt, eliminating any possibility that they could claim ignorance of the proceedings. The first response came from Rebecca, who called me crying hysterically the day after she was served. "Marlene, how could you do this to me?" She sobbed into the phone. "I'm being sued by my own sister. Do you have any idea how humiliating this is?" I had steeled myself for this conversation, knowing that Rebecca would try to manipulate me through emotional appeals and guilt. "You had 30 days to respond to the demand letter," I said calmly. "You chose to ignore it." "I thought you were just angry about the wedding," Rebecca said. "I didn't think you were serious about actually suing me. We're family, Marlene." "Family doesn't sue family." "Family doesn't abandon family at weddings either," I replied. "And family doesn't ignore legal demands for repayment of debts." Rebecca's tears turned to anger with the swift emotional pivot I had witnessed countless times over the years. "You're destroying our relationship over money. Is that really what you want? To lose your sister forever because you can't forgive a debt?" "I'm not trying to destroy anything," I said. "I'm trying to collect money you legitimately owe me. If our relationship can't survive you paying back what you borrowed, then maybe it wasn't as strong as I thought." "I don't have $20,000, Rebecca protested. "You know I don't have that kind of money. I'm living paycheck to paycheck." "Then you'll need to work out a payment plan or face the legal consequences," I said. "Those are your choices." Rebecca hung up on me, but not before informing me that Rick had been having second thoughts about their engagement since learning about the lawsuit. Apparently, her new fiancé was reconsidering whether he wanted to marry someone who was being sued by her own family for unpaid debts. David's response was more measured, but equally predictable. He didn't call me directly. Instead, he had his bankruptcy attorney contact Patricia to discuss the lawsuits in the context of his planned bankruptcy filing. Patricia called me after speaking with David's lawyer. "They're trying to expedite his bankruptcy to eliminate your claims," she explained. "But we're ahead of them. Our lawsuits were filed before his bankruptcy petition, which gives us certain protections." "What does that mean practically?" I asked. "It means that even if David's bankruptcy eliminates his obligation to pay you directly, we can still pursue the co-signed equipment leases as separate matters. More importantly, we can challenge the bankruptcy if we can prove he transferred assets or incurred debts in bad faith before filing." This was where Patricia's experience with family financial disputes became invaluable. She had immediately begun investigating David's financial transactions over the past year, looking for evidence of asset transfers, hidden income, or fraudulent conveyances that might disqualify him from bankruptcy protection. What she found was damning. David had purchased a new truck 6 months earlier, financing it through a dealership but registering the title in his girlfriend's name. He had also transferred ownership of his personal motorcycle and boat to friends, claiming they were gifts, but providing no documentation of the supposed sales. Most significantly, he had closed a business savings account containing nearly $15,000 and deposited the money into a personal account that wasn't disclosed in his bankruptcy. Paperwork. "This isn't just poor financial planning," Patricia explained. "This is deliberate fraud. He was preparing for bankruptcy while hiding assets and transferring property to keep it out of reach of creditors." The discovery of David's fraudulent asset transfers changed everything. Patricia filed motions to challenge the bankruptcy, alleging fraud and bad faith. She also amended our lawsuit to include claims for fraudulent conveyance and sought to recover the hidden assets for distribution to legitimate creditors. My mother's situation was different but equally revealing. She responded to the lawsuit by hiring an attorney from a local legal aid clinic someone who specialized in protecting elderly clients from financial exploitation. Her attorney called Patricia to discuss a settlement, arguing that my mother was on a fixed income and couldn't afford to pay the debt without jeopardizing her basic living expenses. Mrs. Collins is a 78-year-old widow living on Social Security, the legal aid attorney explained to Patricia. The amount your client is demanding represents more than 6 months of her total income. Pursuing this debt would constitute elder financial abuse. Patricia's response was swift and factual. Mrs. Collins received medical and home maintenance services totaling over $8,000 that were paid for by my client. She received valuable consideration in exchange for the debt. The fact that she's elderly doesn't eliminate her obligation to pay for services she received. The legal aid attorney tried a different approach. Surely your client doesn't want to be responsible for making her own mother homeless. If we're forced to pay this judgment, Mrs. Collins will have to sell her house. That's Mrs. Collins's choice to make, Patricia replied. She can arrange a payment plan, she can downsize to a less expensive living situation, or she can face the legal consequences of her unpaid debts. But her age doesn't give her the right to avoid paying for services she received. The conversation revealed something important about my mother's financial situation. She wasn't struggling to pay the debt because she was genuinely impoverished. She was struggling because she had grown comfortable living beyond her means, knowing that I would cover any expenses that exceeded her Social Security income. Her house was worth nearly $200,000, completely paid off. Thanks to my father's life insurance and my help with maintenance over the years. She could easily afford to pay the $8,000 debt by taking a small home equity loan or by downsizing to a more affordable living situation. She simply didn't want to be inconvenienced by the consequences of her choices. The legal proceedings moved forward with bureaucratic efficiency. Court dates were scheduled, discovery motions were filed, and depositions were taken. Each step in the process cost my family members additional legal fees while reinforcing the seriousness of the situation they now faced. During this time, I received several attempts at family intervention. My Aunt Margaret, my father's sister who lived in another state, called to express her shock at learning about the lawsuits. "Marlene, dear," she said in the tone reserved for family members who had disappointed everyone, "I can't believe you're actually suing your own mother and siblings. What would your father think about this family fighting over money?" I had expected this type of interference, had prepared myself for the family members who would emerge from the periphery to offer unsolicited opinions about my legal actions. "My father would think that people should pay their debts," I replied. "And he would be appalled that his children took advantage of their sister for 20 years, while refusing to show up when she needed support." "But they're your family," Aunt Margaret protested. "Money comes and goes, but family is forever." "Family shows up for each other," I said, using the phrase that had become my standard response to guilt-based appeals. "Family doesn't abandon each other at important moments and then expect continued financial support." Aunt Margaret tried a different approach. "What about Christmas? What about family gatherings? Are you really going to let legal disputes destroy decades of family relationships?" I had been thinking about this question since filing the lawsuits. What would holidays look like now? Would there still be family gatherings? Would my family members attend events where I was present, or would they expect me to be excluded as punishment for pursuing my legal rights? "The family relationships were already damaged," I said finally. "I'm just tired of pretending they weren't." The truth was that I hadn't enjoyed family gatherings in years. Every holiday meal had become an opportunity for someone to mention their latest financial crisis. Every birthday party had been interrupted by whispered conversations about money problems and potential solutions. Every family celebration had been overshadowed by the tension of unspoken expectations and unmet obligations. I realized that I had been dreading family events for a long time, anticipating the requests and manipulation that would inevitably accompany any gathering. The lawsuits hadn't destroyed my family relationships. They had simply made visible the dysfunction that had been festering for years. 2 months after the lawsuits were filed, Patricia called with significant news. David's bankruptcy had been dismissed due to the fraudulent asset transfers we had discovered. The bankruptcy judge had ruled that David's attempts to hide property and income constituted bad faith, disqualifying him from bankruptcy protection. "What does that mean for our lawsuit against him?" I asked. "It means he's fully liable for his debts, including what he owes you," Patricia explained. "We can now pursue collection against all of his assets, including the truck and other property he tried to hide." David's attorney immediately requested a meeting to discuss settlement options. David was facing the possibility of having his wages garnished, his hidden assets seized, and liens placed on any property he owned or acquired in the future. Without bankruptcy protection, he was vulnerable to the full force of debt collection proceedings. The settlement meeting took place in Patricia's conference room on a gray February morning. David arrived with his attorney, looking haggard and defeated in a way I had never seen before. His usual confident demeanor was gone, replaced by the deflated posture of someone who had run out of options. David's attorney opened the negotiations by acknowledging the debt, but requesting a payment plan that would allow David to pay over several years rather than in a lump sum. "My client recognizes his obligation to Ms. Collins," the attorney said, "but he's currently unemployed due to the closure of his business and the ongoing legal issues. He's seeking employment, but hasn't been able to find steady work in his field." Patricia consulted her notes before responding. "Your client owes $35,000 in direct loans, plus he's responsible for approximately $35,000 in equipment lease obligations where Ms. Collins served as co-signer. We're prepared to discuss payment arrangements, but the total amount isn't negotiable." David's attorney looked surprised. $70,000? We were under the impression that this was about the personal loans only. "Your client's failed bankruptcy attempt means he's responsible for all debts," Patricia explained, "including the co-signed obligations that would have been discharged if the bankruptcy had been successful." I watched David's face as the full scope of his liability became clear. $70,000 represented more than 2 years of income at his previous salary. Money he would have to earn while also paying for basic living expenses. "I can't pay $70,000, David said finally, speaking directly to me for the first time since the meeting began. "Marlene, you know I don't have that kind of money." "You should have thought about that before missing Sarah's wedding and then trying to stick me with your debts through bankruptcy fraud," I replied. David's attorney requested a recess to consult privately with his client. When they returned, they proposed a settlement offer. David would acknowledge the full debt and agree to a payment plan of $500 per month for the next 10 years. I looked at Patricia, who shook her head slightly. $500 per month would total only $60,000 over 10 years, and there was no guarantee that David would actually make the payments consistently. "Counteroffer," Patricia said. "Full acknowledgement of the $70,000 debt, payment of $1,000 per month for 6 years, with the entire balance becoming immediately due if he misses more than 2 payments." David's attorney requested another private consultation. This time they were gone for nearly 20 minutes, and I could hear raised voices through the conference room walls. When they returned, David looked resigned to his fate. "We accept the terms," his attorney said, "but we want it noted for the record that this payment plan will represent a significant hardship for my client." "Noted," Patricia said dryly. "Just as my client's 20 years of unpaid loans represented a significant hardship for her." Rebecca's situation proved more complicated. She had retained an attorney who specialized in consumer debt defense, someone who was skilled at finding technicalities and procedural errors that might invalidate collection efforts. Her attorney argued that the loans I had made to Rebecca were gifts rather than debts, since there had been no formal loan agreements and no explicit expectations of repayment discussed at the time the money was transferred. Patricia had anticipated this defense and had prepared accordingly. She had compiled evidence showing a pattern of requests for temporary help, followed by acknowledgments of intent to repay when circumstances improved. Rebecca's own text messages and emails were filled with promises to pay me back as soon as things turned around, or after the next paycheck. More damaging was Rebecca's recent request for wedding funding, which had been predicated on my history of family financial support. Her willingness to ask for additional money while owing $20,000 from previous requests demonstrated that she viewed our financial relationship as ongoing debt rather than completed gifts. The most compelling evidence came from Rebecca herself. During her deposition, she admitted under oath that she had always intended to repay the money when she was financially able, and that she understood the transfers to be loans rather than gifts. Her attorney tried to argue that family loans were different from commercial debts, that the informal nature of family financial assistance created different expectations and obligations. Patricia's response was devastating in its simplicity. "Family loans are still loans," she told the judge during a preliminary hearing. The defendant received valuable consideration in the form of cash transfers that prevented foreclosure, repossession, and other financial consequences. The fact that she's related to the plaintiff doesn't eliminate her obligation to repay money she borrowed. Rebecca's case went to trial, providing a public forum for the details of our family's financial dysfunction. Witnesses testified about Rebecca's pattern of financial crises and my history of providing emergency assistance. Bank records documented thousands of dollars in transfers over several years, always in response to urgent requests for help. The trial lasted 3 days and attracted attention from local media, who were interested in the unusual spectacle of a family debt dispute being resolved in court. Rebecca's attempts to portray herself as the victim of predatory family lending fell flat when the evidence showed the voluntary nature of her borrowing and her explicit promises to repay. The judge ruled in my favor, finding that Rebecca owed the full $20,000 plus interest and court costs. The judgment was entered as a matter of public record, ensuring that Rebecca's failure to pay family debts would affect her credit rating and future borrowing ability. Rebecca's attorney immediately filed an appeal, but the appellate process would take months and would require Rebecca to post a bond securing the judgment amount. Her new fiancé, Rick, faced with the prospect of marrying someone who owed significant legal judgments and was engaged in ongoing litigation, quietly ended their engagement. Rebecca called me after Rick broke up with her, not to apologize or offer payment, but to blame me for destroying her chance at happiness. "I hope you're satisfied," she said, her voice thick with tears and anger. "Rick says he can't marry someone who's in legal trouble with her own family. You've ruined my life. Over money." "I didn't ruin your life," I replied. "I asked you to pay back money you borrowed. The fact that your fiancé couldn't handle that says more about him than it does about me." "He was the best thing that ever happened to me," Rebecca sobbed. "He was stable and kind, and he wanted to take care of me. Now he's gone because you couldn't forgive a family debt." I felt a moment of sadness for Rebecca, recognizing the genuine pain in her voice. But I also recognized the pattern that had defined our relationship for decades. Rebecca had expected me to absorb the consequences of her choices, to protect her from the results of her own actions, to prioritize her comfort over my own rights. "Rebecca," I said gently, "Rick didn't leave because I sued you. Rick left because you owe $20,000 and refused to take responsibility for paying it back. He left because you demonstrated that you don't honor your obligations." "That's not fair," Rebecca protested. "I would have paid you back eventually." "Eventually isn't good enough anymore," I said. "I needed you to show up for Sarah's wedding, and you didn't. I needed you to respond to my demand letter, and you didn't. I needed you to acknowledge your debt, and you didn't. At some point, eventually, has to become now." My mother's case proved to be the most emotionally difficult. The legal aid attorney representing her continued to argue that pursuing debt collection against an elderly widow constituted elder abuse, but the argument gained no traction with the court. During her deposition, my mother appeared frail and confused, claiming not to remember receiving money from me for medical bills and home maintenance. Her attorney suggested that her age and recent grief might have affected her memory of financial transactions. Patricia was prepared for this strategy as well. She had obtained copies of all the checks I had written to medical providers and repair contractors on my mother's behalf, along with documentation showing that my mother had specifically requested the payments and had signed authorizations for me to handle the transactions. More importantly, Patricia had evidence that my mother's memory was selective. While she claimed not to remember receiving financial assistance from me, she had detailed recollections of David's legal troubles and Rebecca's relationship problems. She could recall with perfect clarity why she had needed to leave Sarah's wedding early, but couldn't remember asking me to pay for her broken air conditioning system. The judge was not impressed by the selective memory defense. During the hearing, he noted that my mother had been competent enough to make decisions about leaving family celebrations early, but claimed incompetence when asked about financial obligations. The defendant appears to have clear recollection of events that benefit her position while claiming memory loss regarding events that create legal obligations, the judge observed. This court finds her testimony regarding financial assistance to be not credible. The judgment against my mother was entered for the full $8,000 plus court costs and interest. Her attorney immediately filed motions requesting a payment plan based on her limited income, but Patricia argued that my mother had sufficient assets to pay the judgment through home equity financing or downsizing. The court agreed, noting that my mother owned a valuable property free and clear, and had options for satisfying the judgment without endangering her basic living needs. My mother called me after the judgment was entered, her voice small and defeated. "Marlene," she said, "I never thought you would actually take your own mother to court over money. I raised you better than this." The accusation stung because it contained a grain of truth. She had raised me to be generous, to help family members in need, to put others' needs before my own. But she had also raised me to honor my obligations and to take responsibility for my choices. "You raised me to pay my debts and keep my commitments," I said. "I'm asking you to do the same." "I'm 78 years old," my mother said. "I'm too old to start over financially. If I have to sell my house to pay this judgment, where will I live?" It was a fair question, and one that I had wrestled with throughout the legal proceedings. I didn't want my mother to be homeless or destitute, but I also couldn't continue to absorb the financial consequences of her choices while she prioritized other family members' needs over mine. "You have options," I said. "You can take a small home equity loan to pay the judgment. You can downsize to a smaller, less expensive home. You can move to senior housing that's more appropriate for your age and income level. I've lived in this house for 40 years, my mother said. "Your father and I raised our children here. All my memories are here." "I understand that," I said, "but I've been subsidizing your ability to stay in that house for years, and I can't continue to do it while you choose to support David instead of showing up for Sarah." My mother was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was different, more tired than angry. "I never realized how much you had given us," she said. "I thought you were just doing well financially and didn't mind helping out when we needed it." It was the closest thing to an acknowledgement I had received from any of my family members, and it caught me off guard. "I didn't mind helping," I said honestly. "But I needed to know that the help was appreciated, that it mattered. To you, that you would be there for me when I needed support." "I thought I was being there for you," my mother said. "I thought helping David was helping the family." "David is an adult who made bad business decisions," I replied. "Sarah is your granddaughter who got married once in her life and wanted her grandmother there to celebrate with her. "I made a mistake," my mother said quietly. "I should have stayed at the reception." It was the apology I had been waiting for, but it came too late to change the legal proceedings that were already in motion. "Yes," I said, "you should have." The financial settlements were finalized by early spring. David was paying $1,000 per month under court supervision, with automatic wage garnishment ensuring compliance. Rebecca's judgment remained under appeal, but her wages were being garnished pending the outcome. My mother had taken a home equity loan to pay her judgment in full, avoiding the need for ongoing payment arrangements. The total amount I recovered was approximately $75,000, representing most but not all of the money my family had borrowed over the years. After legal fees and court costs, I received about $60,000, money I immediately invested in retirement accounts to replace what I had depleted funding their emergencies. But the real victory wasn't financial. It was the restoration of my self-respect and the establishment of boundaries that had been non-existent for decades. My family members had learned that their actions had consequences, that taking advantage of my generosity would result in legal rather than emotional consequences. They had discovered that my love for them didn't extend to absorbing unlimited financial abuse while receiving contempt and abandonment in return. Most importantly, I had learned that family loyalty was supposed to be reciprocal. Real family members showed up for each other, supported each other through difficulties, and honored their obligations to each other. People who shared my DNA but failed to meet those standards weren't family in any meaningful sense. The lawsuits had ended, but the real transformation was just beginning. 6 months after the last judgment was entered, I stood in the courthouse lobby again, this time as an observer rather than a plaintiff. David's bankruptcy hearing was finally taking place, the legitimate one he had filed after exhausting all appeals and delay tactics. The fraudulent asset transfers had been reversed, his hidden property had been seized, and he was now facing the reality of genuine financial restructuring under court supervision. I watched him shuffle through the metal detectors with his attorney, both men looking worn down by months of legal battles and financial scrutiny. David had aged visibly during the court proceedings, his hair grayer, his shoulders more stooped, his confident swagger replaced by the careful movements of someone who had learned that actions carried permanent consequences. He saw me standing near the elevators and paused, uncertainty flickering across his face. We hadn't spoken directly since the settlement conference where he had agreed to the payment plan that was now automatically deducting $1,000 from his monthly wages. "Marlene," he said, approaching cautiously, "I didn't expect to see you here." "I wanted to witness the end of this process," I replied, "to see how it all turned out." David nodded slowly, as if trying to decide whether my presence represented support or judgment. "I know you probably think I got what I deserved," he said finally. I looked at my younger brother, this man who had once taught my daughter to throw a curveball, who had helped me move furniture when James and I bought our first house, who had been part of my life for over 40 years. "I think you got what your choices earned you," I said. "There's a difference." David's attorney appeared at his elbow, clearly eager to move toward the courtroom where David's financial future would be determined by a federal bankruptcy judge. "I need to go," David said. "But Marlene, I want you to know that I understand." "Now what I put you through? The money, the wedding, all of it. I'm sorry it took a lawsuit to make me see it." It was the first genuine apology any of my family members had offered, and it came too late to repair our relationship, but early enough to provide some closure. "I hope things work out for you," I said, and I meant it. Not because I was ready to resume our previous dynamic, but because I no longer needed his suffering to validate my own worth. David's bankruptcy hearing lasted 3 hours and resulted in a structured repayment plan that would consume most of his discretionary income for the next 5 years. The court appointed a trustee to oversee his finances and ensure compliance with the payment schedule. He would emerge from bankruptcy eventually, but as a man who had learned that financial irresponsibility carried lasting consequences. I drove home through the late afternoon traffic, thinking about the person I had been when this journey began versus the woman I had become. The old Marlene would have felt guilty about David's financial situation, would have wondered if there was something more she could have done to help him avoid bankruptcy. The new Marlene understood that David's bankruptcy was the natural result of his own choices, not something that had been done to him. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It had taken months of therapy with a counselor who specialized in family financial abuse, weeks of reading about codependency and enabling behaviors, and countless conversations with James about the difference between love and obligation. I had learned that my compulsive need to rescue family members had actually prevented them from developing their own problem-solving skills and financial responsibility. By constantly providing bailouts and emergency funding, I had enabled their irresponsible behavior while exhausting my own resources and emotional energy. The counselor had helped me understand that true love sometimes meant allowing people to experience the consequences of their choices, even when those consequences were painful. Enabling behavior, disguised as family loyalty, actually hurt everyone, involved by preventing growth and perpetuating dysfunction. Sarah and Michael had returned from their honeymoon to discover the legal drama that had unfolded during their absence. Sarah's initial reaction had been shock and concern about the family conflict, but as she learned the details of what had transpired, her support for my actions had been unwavering. "Mom," she had said during one of our weekly phone calls, "I watched you give and give and give to them for my entire childhood. I watched them take advantage of your generosity while treating you like their personal bank account. What you did took courage." Michael had been equally supportive, sharing stories from his own family about relatives who had learned to respect boundaries only after facing real consequences for crossing them. "In my family," he had explained, "we learned early that actions have results." "It sounds like your family never learned that lesson, because you protected them from it." The distance from my extended family had been initially painful, but ultimately liberating. Christmas had been celebrated with just James, myself, and Murphy the golden retriever, a quiet celebration that felt peaceful rather than empty. We had video called Sarah and Michael, who were spending the holiday with his family in Connecticut, and shared stories about their new traditions as a married couple. There had been no dramatic scenes over gift exchanges, no whispered conversations about money problems, no tension over who would help with cleanup or who would pay for extra groceries. Just a calm, loving celebration focused on gratitude and connection rather than obligation and expectation. Rebecca had moved back in with my mother after Rick ended their engagement, creating a household dynamic that I observed from a distance with detached interest. Rebecca's wages continued to be garnished to satisfy the judgment against her, a monthly reminder that financial obligations didn't disappear simply because they were inconvenient. My mother had adapted to life with a home equity loan payment, by taking in Rebecca as a paying tenant, finally learning to charge family members for the costs they generated, rather than absorbing those costs herself. The arrangement seemed to be working for both of them, providing my mother with additional income and giving Rebecca a structured living situation with clear financial expectations. I had seen them together at the grocery store a few weeks earlier, both women looking older but more settled than they had during the chaos of the legal proceedings. They had nodded politely when they saw me, but none of us had attempted conversation. The wounds were still too fresh, the boundaries still too new. Spring brought unexpected contact from Rebecca in the form of a formal letter delivered by certified mail. Inside was a cashier's check for $5,000 and a brief note explaining that she had received a tax refund and wanted to make a payment toward her judgment balance. The letter contained no personal message, no request for reconciliation, just a straightforward business communication acknowledging her debt and providing partial payment. It was exactly the kind of communication I had hoped for, professional and responsible without emotional manipulation or guilt-based appeals. I deposited the check and sent a receipt through my attorney, maintaining the formal structure that had replaced our previous chaotic family financial dynamic. The transaction felt clean and final, like a debt being paid rather than a family relationship being repaired. Summer arrived with news that David had found steady employment as a senior mechanic at a dealership across town. His new job paid less than his failed business had generated during good months, but it provided consistent income and health insurance benefits. The job also came with restrictions, as his bankruptcy trustee had to approve any overtime work or side jobs that might generate additional income. I heard about David's employment from James, who had run into David's former business partner at the hardware store. The information came without commentary or suggestion that I should reach out to congratulate David on his job. James had learned to share family news as factual updates rather than opportunities for renewed contact. My mother's situation had stabilized as well. The home equity loan payment was manageable within her budget, especially with Rebecca contributing to household expenses. She had also begun attending a senior center that provided social activities and meal programs, reducing her isolation and creating new friendships that didn't revolve around family drama. According to neighbors who still spoke with both of us, my mother seemed happier and more engaged than she had been in years. The structure and clarity of her new financial situation, combined with Rebecca's presence in the house, had given her purpose and stability that didn't depend on managing other people's crises. As autumn approached, marking nearly a year since Sarah's wedding, I found myself reflecting on the person I had become versus the person I had been. The old Marlene had measured her worth by how much she could give to others, how many problems she could solve, how many people she could rescue from the consequences of their own choices. The new Marlene measured her worth by different standards. How well she maintained healthy boundaries, how effectively she communicated her needs and expectations, how successfully she balanced generosity with self-preservation. I had learned to say no without guilt, to offer sympathy without solutions, to love people while refusing to enable their destructive behaviors. These skills had required practice and conscious effort, but they had become more natural with time and repetition. My real estate business had flourished during the year of family legal drama, perhaps because I was no longer distracted by constant financial emergencies and emotional crises. I closed more deals, earned higher commissions, and built stronger professional relationships. Clients seemed to respond positively to my increased confidence and clearer communication style. James and I had used some of the recovered family debt money to take a vacation to Ireland, something we had talked about for years, but never prioritized due to family financial obligations. The trip had been magical. 2 weeks of exploring ancient castles and green countryside without worrying about emergency phone calls or urgent requests for money. "You're different," James had observed one evening as we sat in a pub in County Cork, listening to traditional Irish music and sharing stories with fellow travelers. "How am I different?" I had asked. "You're here," he said simply. "Really here, present in the moment, not worried about what crisis might be happening at home or what problem someone might need you to solve." He was right. For the first time in decades, I was living my own life instead of managing everyone else's emergencies. On the first anniversary of Sarah's wedding, she and Michael drove up from Connecticut to visit us for the weekend. They brought photos from their first year of marriage, stories about their new apartment, and news that Sarah had been promoted to a senior engineering position at her firm. As we sat on the back porch where James and I had made the decision to pursue legal action against my family, Sarah brought up the subject that we had all been carefully avoiding. "Mom," she said, "I know this year has been difficult with the family situation. Do you ever regret what you did?" I considered the question carefully, thinking about the financial recovery, the restored boundaries, the peace of mind that had replaced constant anxiety about family drama. "I regret that it was necessary," I said finally. "I regret that people I loved for decades couldn't show up when it mattered. But I don't regret standing up for myself and protecting our family's financial security." Michael nodded approvingly. In law school, we studied cases where family financial abuse went on for decades because the victims were too emotionally invested to seek legal remedies. What you did was actually pretty common, just not commonly talked about. Sarah reached over and squeezed my hand. "I'm proud of you, Mom. I know it wasn't easy, but you showed me what it looks like to have self-respect and maintain boundaries. Those are lessons I'll carry into my own marriage and family relationships." The conversation reminded me that my actions had consequences beyond my immediate family situation. Sarah was learning to build her adult relationships based on mutual respect and reciprocity rather than one-sided giving and taking. She was entering her marriage with healthy expectations about financial responsibility and family loyalty. Michael was learning from both our positive example and my family's negative example, understanding that love and obligation were different things, that genuine care sometimes meant allowing people to face the results of their choices. Winter returned with a Christmas card from Rebecca, the first personal communication I had received from her since the formal debt payment letter. The card contained a brief message thanking me for the lessons I had taught her about financial responsibility and personal accountability. "I'm working 2 jobs now to pay down my debts," she had written. "It's hard, but I'm learning to live within my means instead of depending on other people to rescue me. I'm not ready to rebuild our relationship yet, but I wanted you to know that I understand why you did what you did." The card represented growth and self-awareness that I hadn't expected from Rebecca. She was learning to take responsibility for her choices rather than blaming others for the consequences of those choices. The financial pressure had forced her to develop skills and independence that decades of family bailouts had prevented her from acquiring. I sent a brief card in return, wishing her well in her efforts to achieve financial stability and acknowledging her progress toward independence. It wasn't a reconciliation, but it was a recognition of mutual respect that might someday form the foundation for a healthier relationship. David's payments had continued without interruption throughout the year, automatically deducted from his wages and deposited into my account every month. The consistency of the payments, enforced by legal structure rather than family guilt, had created a business-like relationship that was more reliable than our previous emotional dynamic. I had used David's monthly payments to fund a college scholarship in Sarah's name, creating something positive from the recovered debt money. The scholarship would help other young women pursue engineering degrees, ensuring that David's financial irresponsibility would ultimately contribute to someone else's educational success. My mother's situation had remained stable throughout the year, with no emergency calls for financial assistance or dramatic crises requiring immediate intervention. The combination of structured living expenses and Rebecca's financial contribution had created a household budget that actually worked within their combined income. I had driven past my childhood home occasionally during the year, noting the small improvements that had been made with Rebecca's help. The yard was better maintained, the exterior had been freshly painted, and there was a general air of stability that had been missing during the years of constant financial crisis. As the second anniversary of Sarah's wedding approached, I realized that the legal proceedings had accomplished something more important than debt recovery. They had created space for all of us to develop healthier patterns and more authentic relationships. My family members had learned to manage their own financial problems rather than expecting me to provide endless bailouts. I had learned to offer emotional support without financial rescue, to express love through boundaries rather than enabling. Sarah and Michael had learned to build their marriage on principles of mutual responsibility and reciprocal care. The courthouse where it all began now held different meaning for me. It was no longer the place where I had been forced to seek justice against family members who had betrayed my trust. It was the place where I had reclaimed my self-respect and established the boundaries that had allowed all of us to grow into more authentic versions of ourselves. Standing in my kitchen on a quiet Sunday morning, looking out at the garden James and I had planted with money recovered from family debt settlements, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades. I felt proud of the choices I had made, confident in the boundaries I had established, and hopeful about the relationships I was building based on mutual respect, rather than financial dependence. The woman who had been abandoned at her daughter's wedding reception had fought back in the most effective way possible. Not through anger or revenge, but through legal accountability and personal transformation. I had taken my family to bankruptcy court. But more importantly, I had taken myself to a place of strength and self-respect that no one could ever take away. The silence that had once felt like abandonment now felt like peace. The distance that had once felt like punishment now felt like freedom. The boundaries that had once felt like barriers now felt like protection. I was no longer the family bank, the emergency contact, the solution to everyone else's problems. I was Marlene Collins, a woman who had learned to value herself enough to demand that others value her too. And that was the most important victory of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.